Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr Tim Clarkson to the podcast to discuss Æthelflaed, Lady of the Mercians and daughter of Alfred the Great. Tim Clarkson is a historian and author whose main research interest is in the early medieval period. He obtained an MPhil in archaeology and a PhD in medieval history, both from the University of Manchester. Over the last 15 years or so, he has written 8 books covering a variety of themes, ranging from the Scottish legends of Merlin to the early history of the Isle of Man. From 2012 to 2016, he participated in a number of community heritage projects at Govan in Scotland as a historical advisor. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society in 2024. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome to the podcast, Tim. How are you?
Not too bad, thanks, Jess. How are you?
I'm brilliant, thank you. I'm really looking forward to today because we are talking about Æthelflaed, and she's quite an interesting figure. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background first?
Yeah, I'm an independent researcher. I'd sort of describe myself as an author and a historian. My sort of work background is in academic librarianship, and I came into the sort of the history side from a long-standing interest in history going back to childhood. But my first degree, my undergraduate degree, wasn't in history. It was in sort of information studies and stuff connected with libraries. But while I was working in the university library in Manchester, I had the opportunity to study for an MPhil part-time while I was working full-time. And so I thought, well, I could use some of my sort of interest in sort of history and archaeology and, do an MPhil in a topic that's of interest to me. So I did an MPhil in early medieval archaeology, and that was on the Solway Firth area of northern Britain. And I was looking at the sort of the kingdoms and the hill forts and things that were around that area in the sort of 6th and 7th centuries and that kind of period. And then straight after that, I had the opportunity to do a PhD, again, part-time while I was working full-time at the university library. And I did the PhD in medieval history, and I looked at the warfare in early medieval northern Britain, mostly sort of relating to early Scotland, the Picts and the early Scots, and going right through to the Viking period. And so after completing the PhD, I actually left academic libraries and set up a business with my wife that was completely unrelated to history or academia. But while we were doing that, I decided to see if I could turn parts of my PhD thesis into one or more books. And out of that came my first book, which was on the Picts, and then another one on early Scotland, and then a couple more kind of sort of spin-offs from the same kind of topic. And then I've sort of carried on, and I've got sort of 8 books under my belt at the moment, and of course one of them is on Æthelflaed, and it's sort of keeping me going. Yeah.
Why did you decide to write a book about Æthelflaed?
When I was doing my PhD, because the topic was on early medieval warfare in northern Britain. I looked at sort of Britain and Ireland together, for sort of comparative purposes, and I looked at the sort of Anglo-Saxon Southern English kingdoms as well to see how they compared with early Scotland in terms of how the warfare was organised, and that in the sort of 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. And it was reading around that I really first encountered Æthelflaed, and found her, a fascinating person who kind of really stood out, obviously because, she was a woman who was undertaking this sort of dual role of rulership of what had been a kingdom, and military leadership as well, and organizing armies, and getting involved in the business of warfare in a way that other women of around that time didn't seem to have the opportunity to do. And so I sort of started reading a little bit more about her, and after a while decided that I'd like to write a biography of her. And the timing of that worked out okay, because by the time I'd sort of finished writing my sort of last book on early Scotland, it was kind of sort of around about 2016, 2017, and the 1100th anniversary of Æthelflaed's death was coming up in 2018. And so I thought, well, if I can get a book out for then, that would be a nice kind of timing. And so that's what I aimed for. And so my biography of her came out just around about the summer of 2018, when the various celebrations were going on to commemorate her. So yeah, that was the story behind that.
It truly is a fabulous book. I do urge my listeners to get a copy if you haven't read this book already.
Thanks, Jess. That's nice.
When do we know when Æthelflaed was born, and who were her parents?
She was born probably around about the year 869, and we don't know an awful lot about her childhood, but we do know that her parents were King Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, down in the southwest of England, and her mother was Æthelflaed, who was a princess of the royal house of Mercia, the kingdom in the Midlands. And we know that Æthelflaed was one of a number of children that Alfred and Æthelflaed had, who survived, the perils of infancy and reached adulthood. She was the eldest, and she had a brother and a couple of sisters. And we know that she was brought up in a household where her father Alfred was very keen on education, and he had tutors who were brought into the royal household, who would have instructed his children in the Latin language and classical literature, especially sort of biblical texts and Christian writings. So we know that Æthelflaed would have had quite a good education for the time. And again, not an awful lot known about her childhood, but we can imagine that, being a royal princess, she wouldn't have really lacked for anything. She would have probably had quite a comfortable childhood, apart from a kind of a really traumatic event that came about when she was probably about 9 years old, 8 or 9 years old, in the year 878. Now, at that time, the Vikings, the warriors from Norway and Denmark, who'd been raiding and settling around Britain and Ireland for 80 odd years, they had taken over a large part of what is now Eastern England, and they were looking to grab more and more territory off the English, off the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And they'd already pretty much taken over the kingdom of Mercia in the Midlands, where Æthelflaed's mother had come from. And they had their eyes on the kingdom of Wessex, where her father, King Alfred, was the ruler. And in 878, they launched an attack on Wessex just after Christmas in early January. And we have a kind of brief account of this from the time. And it appears that the royal family, King Alfred and his wife and children, had just probably finished celebrating the Christmas season, and it was early January. And usually that's a time when not a lot of warfare went on, partly because of the weather, obviously, and it was a kind of a downtime usually for military campaigns, certainly for large-scale raids and things. But the Vikings decided to attack at that time, and they targeted the King Alfred's palace at Chippenham in what is now Wiltshire. And we can imagine that this must have been obviously a surprise attack, and must have been very frightening for King Alfred's young children. Æthelflaed was the eldest, but she was only, as I say, about 8 or 9. And all of a sudden, her life was turned upside down, and the royal palace or residence where she'd just been celebrating the Christmas period with her family was suddenly a place of battle and slaughter, etc. And luckily, King Alfred managed to get his family out of there safely, and they fled basically as refugees into the marshes of Somerset, which is sort of just in another part of the Kingdom of Wessex. But they had to live there as kind of fugitives, in sort of constant fear of the Vikings coming and capturing them or killing them. And I can only imagine that this must have been a really major traumatic event in Æthelflaed's childhood, which perhaps coloured a lot of her later life. I'm sure that she probably never forgot the terror that she felt when the Vikings attacked at that time. And of course, in later life, she went on to take the war to them. So that to me is probably the event that stands out in her childhood. And I'm sure it was very significant for her.
Yeah, I can imagine that it was quite, she's obviously in her formative years, so this experience will have given her a sense of fear. And also, as we know later on, she doesn't like the Vikings later in life. So this experience is probably why it's because of that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the case, Jess. Yeah.
Who was chosen to be her husband and why?
Her husband was a guy called Æthelred, who was the ruler of what was left of the old kingdom of Mercia in the Midlands. And as I said before, the Vikings had taken over a large part of Mercia. Basically they'd taken the whole eastern part of it. It had been a very large kingdom. And the western part, or part of the western part, managed to kind of carry on as an independent kingdom under English rule. But its ruler at the time of Æthelflaed's marriage was Lord Æthelred. He wasn't called King Æthelred. So his title was Lord of the Mercians. But he was a king in anything but name, really, and it's possible that in some quarters he may have been referred to as a king. But officially he was the Lord of the Mercians. He was a bit older than Æthelflaed. I imagine he was probably maybe 15 to 20 years older than her. He'd been around for quite a while on the political scene. He was renowned as a war leader in his own right, and had become a very staunch ally of King Alfred of Wessex. And the two of them had actually teamed up a lot on campaigns against the Vikings. And so he was well known to Alfred. He would have been quite a regular visitor to King Alfred's court in Wessex. He was certainly Alfred's most high-profile ally and probably the most powerful ally. And he would have known Æthelflaed as she was growing up. So the marriage came about round about the year 886. And around that time, King Alfred and Lord Æthelred had completed the recapture of the city of London, which the Vikings had held for a while. And that was quite a major achievement, actually, to take this city back into English control. And it's possible that the timing of the marriage between Æthelflaed and Lord Æthelred was connected with the immediate aftermath of the recapture of London. And some historians wonder if it was almost like a kind of reward to Lord Æthelred, or an acknowledgement of the part he'd played in the London campaign, that he was allowed to marry King Alfred's daughter. And that would, of course, been a political marriage first and foremost. And it would have further sealed the alliance between Alfred and Æthelred, the alliance between Wessex and Mercia. And so, yeah, he was her husband, and of course the only husband she had.
Do we know much about their marriage?
What we do know is that they ruled together, almost as kind of co-rulers. So in this period, it's the early medieval period. It's quite sort of patriarchal. Politics and warfare and high level sort of activities like that tend to be monopolized by men, and it's unusual to find women having a really high profile politically. And in Wessex, for instance, King Alfred's kingdom, there hadn't really been a lot of scope for women to take part in political life. And in fact, in the early part of the 800s, generation or two before Æthelflaed's time, there had been a queen of Wessex who had kind of taken over the kingdom herself, ruling on her own, but had kind of received a bad press about it, really, and they didn't seem too keen on female rulers after that. But in Mercia, there seems to have been a kind of tradition of royal wives, the wives of the previous kings of Mercia, taking quite an active role in the business of royal government. So they would often accompany their husbands on sort of events connected with the king's rule, such as bestowing gifts of land or rights and privileges on major churches in the kingdom, or on trusted noble families of the kingdom. And often we have records of these events in the form of charters from the time, where the event is sort of described in terms of the king gives land or benefits or rights and privileges to a church or to a noble family. And there's a list of witnesses of the sort of the chief people of the kingdom who kind of witness this, and basically put their names to the charter document. And in a lot of cases with Mercia, we seem to see the king's wife being present there, and her name is up there with the bishops and the key nobles alongside the king. So when Æthelflaed became the wife of Lord Æthelred of Mercia, she took part in the business of royal government, and we see her name turning up on some of the charters where Æthelred had given gifts of land or whatever to churches and noble families. So she certainly seems to be not so much a kind of a wife in the background as a co-ruler, and this kind of seemed to increase later on, because we have quite a strong indication that Lord Æthelred's health began to decline, and he seems to have withdrawn more and more from government and the normal activities associated with a king. And Æthelflaed, his wife, seems to have taken on the responsibilities of that. And so we see her taking more of a prominent role as their marriage goes on. And eventually, of course, Lord Æthelred dies, and we then see Æthelflaed really coming into her own as a sole ruler, ruling Mercia alone. But that's obviously another phase of her life.
As you just mentioned there, Æthelred died after a long time of ill health. How did Æthelflaed maintain her power once Æthelred died?
I think that it was probably a seamless transition. That we get the impression, I think, from the records that we have, that there wouldn't be much opposition to her taking over, and that it would be a fairly smooth transition from being ruled by the Lord of the Mercians to being ruled by his widow, the Lady of the Mercians, as she came to be known. And it seems that the elite of Mercia, so that would be the chief nobles and the chief bishops, that they accepted her quite willingly as their new ruler, which, of course, in those times, fairly unusual. You would normally expect the next ruler to be a male. We know that Æthelred and Æthelflaed didn't have any sons who survived into adulthood, so there was no son to take over. But you would think that maybe he might have had a brother or nephew or some other male relative who would have at least laid a claim on the rulership of Mercia. But instead, it doesn't look as though anybody came forward, and it would seem that the elite of Mercia just were quite happy to appoint his widow as their new ruler in, as I say, what seems to be quite a seamless transition.
You said earlier that we see Æthelflaed really come into her own. In what ways do we see this?
She takes over the reins of power when Lord Æthelred dies, which is in the year 911, and she basically just hits the ground running. So for many years, the two of them had been trying to organize the defense of Mercia against enemies, most notably the Vikings, but also a threat from Wales as well. And they had been building fortified settlements around Mercia, especially in the kind of borderland areas. And when Æthelflaed became sole ruler on her own, she just continued doing that. So we find that we have charters, these documents from the time that indicate that she was going around the realm and building these fortified settlements, which were called boroughs. and they were basically most of them were basically towns with a church and a marketplace and some kind of rampart around the edge, etc., and with a garrison of soldiers as well. And they were designed as strong points, but also as centres of trade. And we have almost a kind of a list of the ones that she built on her own. Or when I say built, obviously that she organised the construction of these places. And the list is in a document that's known as the Mercian Register, which is kind of part of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is a contemporary document from the 10th century. And the Mercian Register tells us, that year after year, she was going around the borders ordering these boroughs to be built. And some of them have survived today as sort of quite major county towns, places like Stafford and Warwick and Chester, which had been a big Roman city, as you know, and she even before her husband died, she is credited with refortifying that and sort of turning it into from a derelict ancient city into a thriving centre of trade and a real strong point against Viking attacks. And so we, like I say, we see her sort of hitting the ground running and just going straight into it and just sort of picking up where her and her husband had left off.
What kind of military leader does she prove herself to be?
She's sort of very successful in terms of certainly dealing with the Viking threat. And, and this was a very real threat to all the sort of independent English territories in the unconquered sort of western part of what is now England. The Vikings had taken over pretty much the whole of the east and had set up their own strong points in these fortified towns, and they were capable of causing havoc. And when they launched a raid from one of these places, it was usually really devastating and would penetrate quite deep into English territory. And so it was a very real threat and quite a problem to deal with. And Æthelflaed seems to have, risen to the challenge as well as anybody else at the time. And she comes across as a competent strategist and a very adept organizer of military forces and military campaigns. And she seems to have worked in some kind of partnership with her younger brother, Edward, who at that time had succeeded their father, Alfred, as King of Wessex. And so the two of them seem to have had some kind of coordination of their military campaigns to kind of push back the Vikings and to try and basically take back the territories in eastern England that the Vikings had held for a couple of generations by then. And between the two of them, they were very successful. And of the two of them, Æthelflaed perhaps seems the more successful and perhaps even the more dynamic. And this is even though the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the main text of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was written in Wessex, seems to go out of its way to sideline her and to kind of minimize her part in all of this warfare and to amplify her brother King Edward's part. Even apart from that, we have the Mercian Register that I mentioned earlier, which does show that she was doing a lot on her own in the military sense, leading campaigns and building these fortified towns and pushing the frontier back towards the east. So yeah, she comes across as a a very competent military leader.
We know towards 917, 918 that Æthelflaed's health starts to deteriorate. Could you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, it's hard to know what it was that was the cause of her death. Um, we know that she died in 918 when she would probably be about 49 years old. But there's nothing indicating what it was. And I mean, we can assume that it wouldn't be, I mean, a lot of kings and rulers at that time would die from wounds sustained in battle. Now, we can assume that this wasn't the case with Æthelflaed, because even though she was a great military leader in the sense of strategies and tactics and organizing campaigns, it's very unlikely that she was present in battles in any kind of combat sense. So, unlike her male contemporaries, like her brother King Edward and her father King Alfred, she probably wouldn't have much of an expectation of dying from wounds sustained in war. So, she must have had perhaps some kind of illness, but there's no reference to it in the sources. So it's beyond knowing that she was roughly, approaching 50 years of age. Other than that, we don't really know anything about her last years.
Do we know where she is buried today?
Yeah, so she was buried next to her husband, Lord Æthelred, in a kind of mausoleum that they'd had built in a church in Gloucester. And Gloucester was an old Roman city, of course, that they'd together had refortified and kind of revamped as one of these boroughs, turning it into a fortified town. And they'd built a church there, which was kind of their own sort of special church. It was originally called St. Peter's. Later, it became known as St. Oswald's Priory. And the ruins of the priory can still be seen today in Gloucester, but there's no trace of any tombs there, anything connected with the burials has long gone. There is a kind of a fragment of a grave cover, kind of like a stone coffin lid almost, that's got some kind of intricate carving on it, and it's from the 10th century, and that can be seen in Gloucester now. And some people wonder if it was connected with either the tomb of Lord Æthelred or the tomb of Æthelflaed herself. It was found at St. Oswald's Priory, so it's possible that that could be a fragment of her sarcophagus, her tomb. But of course, that's just a guess, and we never know. So the actual site of her burial can't be visited, other than the sort of the general area of the ruined priory.
Does Æthelflaed have a legacy?
I think her legacy is in several parts. One sort of obvious part is the towns that still exist today that were founded by her as boroughs, as fortified settlements. And I've mentioned Warwick and Stafford and Chester. And there were others, Bridgnorth in Shropshire and that, and these are quite sort of important settlements today. And the street layout of these places, in some respects, preserves the street layout that existed in those in the time of Æthelflaed. So that's one legacy, a kind of physical legacy that we can see on the ground. There's a kind of an intrinsic legacy, I think, in that she is remembered in what was the old Kingdom of Mercia. there are statues and places named after her in these areas today. So that's a kind of commemoration of her in the areas that she ruled 1,000 years ago. And you can see, as I say, statues. There are roads named after her. There's a big bridge named after her in Runcorn in Cheshire. So there's a kind of memory of her there. And then I suppose another legacy, from a sort of historical point of view, is her significance, because even though she, until recent years, probably wasn't that well known to the general population, she is undoubtedly one of the key figures of the Viking Age in Britain. She's one of the most important and successful rulers of that period, and certainly one of the most outstanding military leaders. And so that's possibly her greatest legacy, that she was a major player in ensuring that England didn't become completely conquered by the Vikings.
I mean, she's just was a remarkable woman. She truly was.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's why she's fascinated me so much, because she really does stand out. And she must have been extremely charismatic, and very competent, and hugely respected. And she deserves whatever accolades can be given to her now. And luckily, especially since the 1100th anniversary celebrations in 2018, her profile is noticeably higher than it was, and more people have heard of her. And of course, a lot of that, I think, is connected with the fact that she's portrayed as a character in the Last Kingdom TV series. I think that's perhaps more than anything else in recent years has brought her profile to the fore, and people who'd never heard of her, people perhaps who'd heard of her father, Alfred the Great, that they would have been probably surprised that his daughter had achieved so much, and been quite an important figure in the Viking Age. Even though obviously the Last Kingdom being sort of a dramatized version of events, it shows her sort of as a kind of a shield maiden type of person, sort of fighting on the front line and that. And that's possibly something that we can say there is no record of, and perhaps would seem unlikely historically. But nevertheless, that TV series has done a great deal to raise her profile, and deservedly so.
Towards the end of the podcast, I like to ask my guests 5 fun history questions. So, firstly, have you got a historical pet peeve?
Probably not really, to be honest. Not sort of relating to anything sort of that happened in history. I think the only thing I can think of is a kind of a personal peeve, and that's that I don't seem to have enough time to read all the really excellent history books that are being published at the moment. So, but that's just a personal gripe more than anything.
And then my list of books that I've bought that I haven't read is getting a bit ridiculous now.
Yeah, I know the feeling, Jess. Yeah, I've got a real backlog here, and I'm never going to get through them. Yeah.
If you could go back to any event or day in history, when would it be and why?
I think it wouldn't be that far back for me. I think I would only go back to 1969, which is within my own lifetime. And I remember I was probably about 7 years old or so, and watching the moon landings, and thinking I'd really like to walk on the moon there, and I think that's probably what I would still want to do if given the chance to go back. I'd probably go back to July 1969 and step out on the moon with those guys. That would be something quite special. Yeah.
No, it really would. Have you got a favourite book? It can be fiction or non-fiction.
My favorite book is The Lord of the Rings, and has been since I first read it in my mid-teens. And I don't really read a lot of fiction, and I tend now to. Well, I used to read The Lord of the Rings every year in book form, but in recent years I've been listening to it as an audiobook, and but it's still an annual tradition for me. That's my favorite book. Yeah.
If you could invite any historical figure to a dinner party, who would it be and why?
Again, I wouldn't be going back probably to the period I studied, the early medieval period. I'd be going back to the sort of the late 1600s, and there was in Ireland there was a blind harper called Turlo O'Carolan who used to go around the sort of the noble families in Ireland and would recite music that he'd composed, and he played on his harp for them. And I've got quite a bit of his music on vinyl, etc., that I've accumulated over the years, and it's a kind of one of my favourite types of music to listen to, especially to relax to. And I'd probably invite him to the dinner party and ask him to get his harp and play a few of his tunes, and that would certainly suit me. Yeah,
A nice little bit of music while you're just eating your grand meal.
absolutely. Yeah,
And finally, have you got a favourite historical fact?
I think the one that sort of stands out for me, and it's one that I have come across actually while I've been studying the early Scotland, and it actually is goes back to Roman times. It's to the sort of the sort of three around about the year 300 or thereabouts, and it's whether it's a fact or not is a moot point. But there's a Roman writer called Cassius Dio who had written about a campaign by the Roman emperor in Scotland, and against the local sort of tribes there. And there's one incident where the emperor invites the chieftain of one of these tribes to a kind of a parley, a sort of a meeting to discuss peace, etc. And their wives, the chief's wife and the Empress of Rome, are left together to sort of have a chat on their own, and the allegedly they talked about promiscuity and whether the tribes of early Scotland, especially the Caledonian tribe, or the Romans were more sort of morally reprehensible in that respect, and so there's a kind of a conversation going on between these two women. Whether it ever occurred, we don't know. But the interesting thing about it is that Cassius Dio sort of gives a kind of like a quote from this conversation, and it's the interesting part of it for me is that it's a kind of it's basically saying that the earliest record we have of words spoken by a woman from Scotland was spoken to the Empress of Rome, who in fact was Assyrian. So I've always thought this is quite an interesting little episode in history, if it happened. And this is the thing with these authors from the time. Often they were trying to push a point of their own, making a comment about the imperial family of Rome rather than giving straightforward history. So we don't really know if this conversation between these two women ever occurred. But to me, it's a little snippet that I quite like, and that the first words spoken by anybody from ancient Scotland, to be honest, that we've got a record of, were by this Caledonian chief's wife, and to this lady from Syria who was the wife of the Emperor of Rome.
Thank you so much for taking the time to come on today and to discuss Æthelflaed.
That's great, Jess, and thanks for inviting me. And I've enjoyed talking to you, and thanks again for your comments about my book. Much appreciated.
Thank you for listening to Her Story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.